I think the connection you were making between the violent and non-violent is probably also similar to the political prisoner versus non-political prisoner, right? And so Mumia gets to be a political prisoner, but what does it mean for someone who lives out a block who committed harm to be a political prisoner? And one reason why I would imagine why we would call people who are not actively political in a certain sense, right, in a Mumia sense or in an Angela Davis sense, political, is because they're not incarcerated for their beliefs. But what is true is that, like Niall just described, the conditions that set the stage for harm are political decisions, right? And depending on how much power you have, it can determine whether you go to prison or not. So today, or yesterday, I guess the story broke that in Michigan, there's going to be a $600 million settlement for some of the people who were victims of the Flint water crisis. 12 people died, so many children in that community were exposed to lead poisoning. And so there were initially criminal investigations, but all of the charges have been dropped. And this is not saying that they should not have been dropped, but all the charges of the people who are responsible for poisoning and killing people, all those charges have been dropped after $30 million was spent on the prosecution to put them in prison. And then the prosecutors have just decided to start from scratch. And there was a political shift, an administration shift, but these are political decisions. Because if I decide to poison someone by putting, poison in their water, I'm probably going to go to prison, maybe, right? But if I hold some level of power and I'm responsible for, the deaths of 12 people who suffer at the hands of my political decisions, then my charges will be dropped. And I try to say, well, the people who suffer home break-ins usually have incomes of about $7,500 a year, right? 75, and the break-ins happen usually as a consequence of economic desperation. So these are political decisions around who gets resources, who gets jobs, who gets education, who gets to be economically desperate. But if a banking system decides to become economically desperate and creates a mortgage crisis and they get to steal entire homes from Black people, from poor people, then there is no charging decisions to be made. It's instead, how do we bail those people out? So we bail out banks, and the language is so ironic because we're bailing them from a non-carceral crisis. And while people in our hoods are struggling to come up with bail money, it's absurd. And so there's deep resonance about seeing people who commit all types of harm as political prisoners, because the conditions that set the stage for that harm are absolutely political. And the last thing I'll say really quickly, just thinking about Sandra's point about the evolution of the Constitution, because it has evolved but not far. The United States still has its own colonies. We have colonies right now. When I went to go do some work in Puerto Rico and I was learning about the acts of austerity under PROMESA, and I learned that right now, thanks to this specially appointed board, fiscal management board, that's actually interestingly modeled like the one that was in Flint, Michigan. And, it's the connections. People, oppressors are so unoriginal in how they, oppress people. So under this fiscal management board, if you're a victim of police violence in Puerto Rico, you can't really sue the police for damages, because this fiscal management board has decided that pursuit is off the table because there's no money to pay victims of police violence. So what we tend to fall back on the mainland U.S., around, well, if this cop isn't going to be prosecuted, at least I can sue. Well, that's just off the table for people who live in colonial territories that the United States own, right? And so it's so unfortunate that, across all of these, settler colonial situations, we see the same practice of oppression. But what gives me the most amount of hope is you see the same level of resistance. And so to answer the last question quickly, what I've been most encouraged by, why I think that, yes, we need more for a mass political project, is for people to continue to hit the streets, to make real-time decisions in the streets, right? So you can stop deportations from happening right now in your community if you band together with other people and block a bus. If you say, no, you're not taking this person today, right? That's rescuing people from custody. That's abolitionist. You're not going to take a step back and wait for someone to be arrested, then to get them representation, then to get them bailed out, then to see them in court. People are doing abolition in the streets right now. They're setting up community care centers in New York and other places to make sure that people have food and medicine and hygiene needs, right? People are tailoring their demands in the middle of the street and saying, we want to defund the police. So there's so many opportunities for small democracy and mass political participation. Well, it's so important that we continue to encourage people to go into the streets and to resist the violence that they're seeing.